We now come to the urgent question. David Hines.
To ask the Secretary of State if she will make a statement on freedom of speech in universities.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It was a Labour government that enshrined the right to freedom of speech, the right to freedom of expression in law. It is a Labour government again that will uphold freedom of speech and academic freedom on our university campuses, not through creating a culture war, but through working with academics, students and campaigners to get this legislation right. The Secretary of State wrote to colleagues and made a written statement on the 24th of July 2024 on her decision to pause further commencement of the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act 2023 in order to consider options. We've heard concerns of minority groups and others that the Act and its implementation may have unintended consequences and result in disproportionate burdens for universities and for student unions. Many are concerned that it could push providers to overlook the safety and well-being of minority groups over fears of sanction and costly action. I want to provide the House with reassurance that this government believes that higher education must be a space for robust discussion which exposes both students and academics to challenging ideas. The decision to pause the Act was made precisely because of the importance of getting this legislation right. The Secretary of State indicated in her written statement that she would confirm her long-term plans for the Act as soon as possible. And since then, officials and ministers have engaged with a wide range of stakeholders on the future of the Act. This includes representatives of higher education providers and academics, including from the Committee for Academic Freedom, Academics for Academic Freedom and the London University's Council for Academic Freedom, and they are continuing to engage with stakeholders before any final decision is made.
David.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This evening, a member of this House was due to speak at an event at Cambridge University. It will not go ahead as planned because of safety concerns. Now, it is absolutely not for us to question operational decision-making, but it absolutely is for us to question this government about legislation and the effects, direct, indirect and chilling, of the decisions that they have made since coming to office. Last year, the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act became law, in the end having attracted cross-party support after extensive working with students and academics. It passed all stages in Parliament. It received royal assent. The Act is about protecting free speech on campus, including for visiting speakers, and it's about academic freedom to challenge conventional wisdom and put forward unpopular or controversial opinions. But in July this year, the new Secretary of State decided not to commence it. She decided that without any parliamentary debate. Now, the Right Honourable Lady speaks about a wide range of stakeholders. 600 academics have written to the Secretary of State, including 7 Nobel Prize laureates in support of the legislation. Does she really think that these academics would support the legislation if it was, as they put it, a Tory hate charter? Will she now agree to meet those academics, and will she please now do the right thing and commence the legislation which Parliament has passed?
So this government is absolutely committed to freedom of speech. The Secretary of State paused the further implementation to consider options to ensure we get this legislation right. And the Secretary of State will confirm as soon as possible the plans for the Act and long-term plans for the continuing of freedom of speech in higher education. The higher education sector, minority groups and unions representing staff on campus have raised concerns about the Act, believing it to be disproportionate and burdensome and damaging to the welfare of students, and fears that sanctions could result in the overlooking of concerns for minority groups. And MPs and peers raised a whole range of these concerns during the bill's passage. By stepping back from the legislation to reflect on what measures introduced are needed, the government is taking a pragmatic approach to ensuring that higher education remains that space for constructive dialogue, that home of diverse opinions, it should not be a battleground for ideological clashes. We are considering next steps. I take on board the Shadow Secretary of State's request for the Minister to meet with the groups that he outlines. She has held a range of meetings with all groups who have concerns and want to have a say in how this consideration continues, and I am sure she will continue to have further groups, and I will specifically pass on the request that he has made.
Reb Stringer.
Universities and academic freedom are vital to the intellectual health and economic health of this country. There was mention of free speech in our manifesto earlier this year. There was no mention of this particular decision, which was made 21 days after the Secretary took office. I find it, therefore, sadly, difficult to support this decision on that basis alone. But also, can my right honourable friend tell me, when she talks about burdensome issues, whether that means the Chinese government threatening our major universities to withdraw resources, because I think that is at the bottom of the pressure that was unduly put on the Secretary of State.
I've heard the honourable gentleman. I recognise his point. However, I absolutely can reassure him that that was not a factor in making this decision. It is very much about making sure we take the time to consider options for the future of this Act, to make sure that we get it right. It is because we believe in upholding the freedom of expression and the freedom of speech in our world-class higher education sector that we want to get this legislation right, and that is why we are considering options, and we will continue to listen and meet with all groups that have an interest in upholding freedom of speech, those that support measures within the Act, those that have concerns about measures in the Act, and we will continue to consult, and we will report back on plans as soon as possible.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Ian Sollum.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Freedom of speech is fundamentally about the freedom to inquire and explore ideas, facts and data that are sometimes difficult and sometimes inconvenient. And it was that lack of facts and data, or even much of an idea, that failed to convince the Liberal Democrats of the need for the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act. It was not based on evidence and it was not proportionate. And the government's decision to halt the implementation is welcome. However, we should take legitimate concerns seriously and should not ignore those that exist within our Jewish communities, including in universities. And what work is the Minister undertaking to ensure that Jewish staff and students feel safe and welcome in our communities, and especially in our universities?
I welcome the honourable gentleman's comments and recognise much within them. The rise in anti-Semitic abuse on higher education campuses is deeply concerning and something that this government takes extremely seriously. We regularly meet with Universities UK to discuss what support they are offering to Jewish students on campus and how they are tackling anti-Semitic abuse. And we also regularly meet with the Union of Jewish Students, University Jewish Chaplaincy and the Community Security Trust, and will continue to do so to make sure that we get this right.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister reflect on the dire inheritance in education, particularly in regard to the higher education sector?
The honourable gentleman raises an important point about the wider landscape and challenge faced within our higher education sector. Our universities are not just vital for upholding freedom of expression, freedom of speech, academic debate and rigour. They are also incredible seats of opportunity that we know must be unleashed up and down this country, and we will continue to do everything we can to support that growth in our economy that we know is supported by our higher education and education across the whole. It is the unleashing of opportunity that we are committed to as a government.
Sir John Whittingdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State has said that she wants to listen to different views, and the Minister has talked about the number of meetings that have taken place. So will she therefore commit to meet the delegation of senior Jewish academics led by Professor David Abulafia, who has already written requesting such a meeting?
Minister.
He is absolutely right. We are absolutely committed to consulting with a wide range of interests in getting this legislation right, and I will certainly pass on his request to the Minister for Higher Education, who is responsible for leading on this work.
Mary Kelly Foord.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the honourable member agree with me that the real threat to academic freedom are cuts to academic subjects and to job insecurity, two issues that the party opposite ignored time and time again when they were in government?
Minister.
My honourable friend raises an important point, and it goes to what I said previously, that this debate is very important. It is important that we have the right framework for freedom of expression and speech within our education system, and particularly that academic rigour that benefits from having the freedom to be challenged and challenge views that should be heard and should be discussed and debated. But she is also right that universities are the powerhouse to opportunity across the country, and we need to make sure that that is unleashed in every part. And as a fellow North Eastern MP, we know how important our universities are in our region to unleashing that opportunity, and we want to see that unleashed right across the country.
Sir Gavin Williamson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do apologise. I've been silenced. The reason that this legislation was brought forward in the first place was so many academics were fearful of being able to speak in those institutions. They did not believe that they had the freedom to express their ideas and views, and they were being silenced by other academics. And that is why this legislation was brought forward. I think it is shocking there's an Act of Parliament that has been passed in this House and has received royal assent, is then just cast aside without the opportunity for members of Parliament to have a vote as to whether they agree with it being cast aside. So will the Right Honourable Lady commit to making sure that this House will have a say as to whether this is going to be allowed to happen?
Minister.
I commend the honourable gentleman on his valiant efforts today in upholding his right to speak on this issue, and I recognise the challenge in relation to ensuring that we have taken the time to get this right, because we want to protect freedom of speech, and we need to make sure this legislation and any legislation assists in that and does not impede it. We also recognise and support the existing duty on higher education providers to support and secure lawful freedom of speech as currently set out in the 1986 Education Act. It remains in force and for Office of Student Registration Conditions. And he is right that we need to get this right. That needs to be upheld. And indeed, having this discussion today supports that push to ensure that that freedom of speech is upheld. And as it passed through this House, as it was considered, and as it is now further considered, it sheds more light on the importance of upholding freedom of speech, and he has contributed to that again today.
John Woodcock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the week that we mark the dark anniversary of 7th of October, can I say that I welcome this government taking the measures that it has to ensure the safety of Jewish students on campus. And would the Minister not agree with me that this shows that this government believes truly that regardless of your religion, you should be able to get on with your studies without concern for your safety?
Minister.
I absolutely agree with him, and I think the same principle applies through every aspect of education, childhood, and into every aspect of society as well. And as a government, we stand with those upholding and securing those rights.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our universities have to be an avenue where individuals can speak and be challenged. The reality is that there is nothing new to freedom of speech. I remember as a president of a students' union constantly having to fight for the right for people to express their views even when I totally disagreed with them. The sad reality is that Jewish students, Jewish academics feel threatened right now by anti-Semites. Let's call them out for what they are, anti-Semites. They must be free to exercise freedom of speech. So will she, in this consideration, make sure that those rights are going to be absolutely upheld with whatever the government come forward with?
Yeah.
I know the Right Honourable Gentleman works very hard in this space, and I do not disagree with a word that he has said. Universities absolutely must be a space for robust discussion, and that is why we have paused the rollout of the Act. But he is right, anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial are abhorrent, and there must be no space for them. So it is right, and that is why we have paused this legislation, to make sure that we get that balance right between freedom of speech and upholding the right for minority groups and others to express their lawful right to freedom of expression as they should.
Douglas McAllister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Previous Conservative education ministers are on the record stating that this flawed legislation could allow those spreading hate and extremism to seek compensation under its measures. Would my honourable friend agree with me that it's right that we look again at this issue to avoid those dangerous consequences?
Minister.
Yeah, the Honourable Gentleman raises an important point, which is why we are currently talking to people with a range of views, including those supportive of the provisions in the Act. We're listening to the concerns of minority groups and others that the Act could encourage universities and colleges to overlook the safety and well-being of minorities because of fear of complaints that costly legal action could push them towards allowing abhorrent hate speech. That is why we are considering this legislation. We need to get this right.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Can the Minister give us any specific examples of a scenario with which the government were confronted by these people who have successfully lobbied for a pause, other than just speaking in general terms about the legislation being disproportionate?
I appreciate the Right Honourable Gentleman's thoughtful question. I cannot give him a specific example here today. The principle that we are working to is that we are looking in great detail at all aspects, all concerns that have been raised, and supportive comments in relation to the Act and what it seeks to achieve. I will pass on his question to the Minister for Higher Education and Skills and ask her to respond accordingly.
Mark Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Student politics is often maligned in this place, and often rightly so. But in 2006, I attended the conference of the National Union of Students and voted that Hizb ut-Tahrir should be no-platformed. It was the right thing to do. Clearly, the party opposite agrees, because in January of this year, they proscribed Hizb ut-Tahrir as a terrorist organisation. Would my honourable friend agree with me that the party opposite's position is in fact a charter for Hizb ut-Tahrir, Holocaust deniers and vaccine deniers to wander our universities freely?
Minister.
I would say in response to my honourable friend who expresses very passionate views on this subject, and it does incite very passionate views because it is a fundamental freedom that we must protect and uphold, and that is why we are taking the time to make sure that we get this right, that we do uphold lawful freedom of expression, freedom of speech in our higher education system, but that we do not give space for unlawful speech, that it goes beyond robust debate.
Ayub Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recently attended universities in Birmingham and I witnessed large protests in relation to the Palestinian issue, attended both by people of faith and non-faith, including Jewish students, which were protesting peacefully. Whilst we accept that there's been a rise in anti-Semitism, there's also been a rise in Islamophobic hate at universities. Will the Secretary of State confirm that she will, with whatever consultations take place, feed back the report of those consultations to this House?
Minister.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his contribution, and he is absolutely right, and I can make that commitment, and I will pass it on to the Minister for Skills and Higher Education and the Secretary of State.
Peter Swallow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I was elected to this place, I was a university lecturer and a teacher, and I worked hard, as did my colleagues, to ensure that in my lecture hall all views could be expressed, interrogated, debated, even those I profoundly disagreed with. Does the Minister agree with me that when members opposite make unsubstantiated claims that students who express Tory views are marked down, it undermines the brilliant hard work that our lecturers...
Hold. You're trying to catch my eye, I think, both of you. Well, that's not the way to do it, I want to reassure you. Sorry about that. Please do ask the question.
Does the Minister agree with me that when members opposite make unsubstantiated claims that Tory students are being marked down, it undermines the hard work our lecturers do to support their students?
My honourable gentleman makes an important point, and this government will uphold freedom of speech and academic freedom on our university campuses. It is that robust debate and challenge to our views that helps you develop and grow in an education setting, but not by creating culture wars. And that is why we will work with academics, students and campaigners and all those with an interest in upholding freedom of speech in our higher education system to get this right.
Sir Christopher Cho.
Mr. Speaker, isn't freedom of speech an absolute freedom and right? And isn't the government going to do something to bring vice-chancellors to account for their failures to deliver freedom of speech on university campuses? 55 years ago, I was the victim of this when the Vice-Chancellor of the university which I was attending tried to prevent me, as the chairman of the Conservative Association, inviting to the university campus a then very prominent member of this House of Commons. And the Vice-Chancellor was forced to stand down eventually, because I wrote what was then a lead letter in the Daily Telegraph, and the Vice-Chancellor was shamed into changing his views, and the visit took place. Doesn't that show that the key to this is having Vice-Chancellors who really believe in freedom of speech?
I think the honourable gentleman has demonstrated well the existing duties on higher education providers to secure lawful freedom of speech, and indeed the rights as citizens to ensure that that is upheld. And he makes an important point, which is why we are talking to people with a whole range of views on this issue to make sure we get it right.
John Fenton Glenn.
Close enough. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Under the draft guidance of the Office... I beg your pardon. Under the draft guidance of the Office for Students, some universities said that they feared that they'd have to revoke their adoption of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism for fear it might contravene this legislation. Does my honourable friend agree with me that this highlights why it's so important to get this right, and it's right to be cautious about how we implement any such legislation? Thank you.
Minister.
I think the honourable gentleman makes the point very well. This department is absolutely committed to upholding the IRA definition and challenging and educating on these issues that a range of members in the House today have raised. So we need to have a robust education system that informs and creates a healthy debate on these issues, but that is lawful and protects the freedom of speech of those expressing those lawful views.
Dr. Lucan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I ask the Minister, does she believe cancel culture and no platforming is a problem? What's her assessment of that? Is it the trend? Is it getting worse? And if so, it's so important, as she has mentioned, why won't she set out a concrete timetable when this new legislation could be brought forward?
I appreciate the honourable gentleman's desire to see whatever changes being brought in place, but for the very reason that we want to get this right, we want to take the time to get this right. We are absolutely committed to free speech. I think I've said that a number of times today, and we want to take the time to make sure that we protect it in the best way possible.
Holden.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. If the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act had been implemented, as would have happened under the last government, in a timetable over the summer, the issue we're now discussing today at the University of Cambridge probably would not have occurred, nor would probably the issue we've seen up in Durham, where the University Debating Society, the Durham Unionist Society, has been kept out of the Students' Union fair. Could the Honourable Lady reflect on the fact that this delay is actually having an impact on freedom of speech in universities right across the country? I understand the Honourable Lady's concerns, Mr. Speaker, but surely actually speed is of the essence here if we're to ensure freedom of speech in our universities.
Minister.
So I would respectfully disagree with the honourable gentleman on this issue. There were many concerns expressed that the legislation that was passed would have the unintended consequences, would create a disproportionate burden, and that is why we have paused it, to step back from it, to reflect on whether the measures introduced by that Act are needed. We absolutely know that it is necessary to uphold freedom of speech. The provisions within the legislation on freedom of expression still exist in legislation and are there to be upheld, and we need to make sure we have the space to have a constructive dialogue on these issues rather than a battleground for ideological clashes, and we are considering the next steps and we will report in due course.
Richard Foord.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When the Minister considers whatever comes next after the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, will she consider the business of foreign funding for international students, their scholarships and for research institutes? In particular, will she make sure that there are no tests or conditions imposed by other states on international scholarships and bursaries and funding for research institutes?
Minister.
The honourable gentleman tempts me into a much broader discussion on higher education. We recognise some of the challenges but also some of the opportunities in this sector, and I am sure the Minister for Skills and Higher Education will be listening to his concerns and considering them as part of the wider work on ensuring we support our higher education and our higher and further education sectors to the very best that they deserve.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can I thank the Minister very much for her response? Will the Minister outline how government will ensure that enshrining freedom of speech means freedom to believe and to express these beliefs without fear or favour, and that it should entitle those with deeply held faith or those who hold true to biological science to discuss these beliefs in gender ideology and indeed in every facet of student life without fear and without favour?
Yes, I can give the honourable gentleman that reassurance that it is for that reason that we are pausing and making sure that we get this legislation right. Freedom of speech and academic freedom are too important to do in any way other than in a considered, pragmatic and consensual approach.
Nick Timothy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the constructive tone that the Minister has used in response to the urgent question today. And she says that she doesn't want this to be a culture war issue. So when the pause was announced by the Secretary of State, will she disown the comments made to the media by special advisers in her department that the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act was a Tory Hate Speech Act?
Minister.
I think I've been very clear in that we need to take a constructive approach. We need to listen to all views on this issue. We need to protect freedom of speech and we need to protect academic expression, and that includes robust debate where necessary and challenging views where we may not want to hear them. But we are listening. We are determined to get this right.
Jerome.
The Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act isn't a government scheme that is being paused. It is an act of Parliament which has received royal assent. So that is a very serious decision to take to stop that in its tracks. So it must have been based on serious evidence. Can the Minister set out what that evidence was? And given that the need to defend freedom of speech is now, how long is this process going to take?
Minister.
I agree with the honourable gentleman that this is a serious issue, and it was a serious and important decision to make, because we need to make sure we have the right foundations in place for long-term securing of free speech in higher education. We will consult with all the groups who have an interest in ensuring we get this right. We're listening to the concerns of those that were concerned about the Act and its implications. We're also listening to those who supported many of the measures within the Act and would like to see action taken to ensure freedom of speech in higher education. And that is why because of the seriousness of this issue, that we have stepped back to ensure we take that pragmatic and long-term approach.
Right, that completes the urgent question. Just let the front benches change over.